Hey, what's up guys? My name is John Weatherby, and in case this is our first time meeting, I'm a full-time travel and landscape photographer based in Florida. One of the most frequent questions that I get asked is how to photograph the Milky Way. So in today's tutorial, I'm going to show you guys the basics of photographing the Milky Way, and then we're going to jump into the post-processing portion where I'll show you guys how to process the photos. So first, let's jump back to last month where we photographed the Milky Way at Zion National Park during the new moon. What's up guys? We're at Zion National Park and we are at this very popular spot called the bonsai tree. So the Milky Way actually rises directly behind it, and we found this out by using the PhotoPills app. So with the PhotoPills app, we actually just pull up the night AR and we can see, right now it's blue hour, and the Milky Way starts to come up right around 1 a.m. and 1:40 is going to be behind it, and about 2 a.m. we can get it to the right of the bonsai tree. So right now we came out a little early while it's still a little bit light out. We're going to get some shots from blue hour, and then we're going to come back later to get the shots for the Milky Way and create a composite possibly, or just see if we can get it all in one shot. We are back at the bonsai tree that we scouted earlier, and we're going to be doing a basic Milky Way lesson tonight. So we're going to show you guys how to shoot the Milky Way for a single exposure, and then we'll also play around and maybe do a longer exposure for the foreground that we can blend the shots back later. So the first thing that we need to do is get our settings dialed in. So we are shooting with the Tamron 15 to 30 millimeter 2.8 lens. So we're going to start out at f2.8 so we can let the most light possible in, and we can get the lowest ISO possible as well. So we'll start with a base ISO of 2500 and go from there. I'm sure that's probably going to be a little underexposed, but we'll start from there, and we'll start with our maximum shutter speed possible without getting star streaks. So to determine our longest possible shutter speed that we can take without getting star trails, we'll use the 500 rule. So the 500 rule states that 500 divided by your focal length will give you the longest possible shutter speed without star trails. So I'm going to actually go on the conservative side and do 400, and I'm just going to divide 400 by 15, and I get 26.6666. So we'll round up to 27. I'll probably go even shorter than that just to be safe. So we'll just start off at 20 seconds and then zoom in to check focus and to see if it's streaking at all, and go from there. So we have our shutter speed at 20 seconds, we have our aperture at f2.8 and ISO 2500. And I'm going to adjust my white balance to be a little bit cooler. So I set that to 3300, so we'll have a little bit cooler of a sky and foreground. Alright, so now we're going to go ahead and zoom in on a star, and we will adjust focus. So again, I'm in manual focus, and I have vibration reduction turned off on the lens since I'm on a tripod. And I'm just going to zoom in as far as I can on a star, and I'm going to adjust it back and forth, so it's going to get big on one side when it's out of focus, and then sharp, and then big on the other side of being out of focus. So we'll go back and forth until we get it perfectly sharp in the center. So basically go back and forth until you get the star as small as possible, and you'll know that you're sharp and in focus. Alright, so I feel pretty confident that that star is as small as it possibly can be, which means that it's going to be as sharp as possible. Alright, so we'll go ahead and take our first shot now. Alright, so that looks really nice. We have a perfect silhouette of the rock and the tree. The sky is basically at a great exposure, and if I'm zooming in, I can see that we are sharp and have lots of details even at ISO 2500. So that looks really nice. Let's go ahead and just bump up to 3200, and we will take another shot now. Alright, so now I can see that I have the sky exposed brighter, and I'm zooming in. I'm still sharp, and it still looks fairly clean. So a big mistake a lot of people do is they don't shoot at the minimum aperture or the maximum aperture, the lowest possible number. So ours is 2.8, so they don't let as much possible light in for the sky. So then they compensate with the ISO and they go higher, and that results in a grainier and noisier image. So ideally, if you're shooting for the sky and you're on a wide angle lens, when you're focused for the stars, you can even get some of the foreground still in focus, being that with the wide angle lens, anything past a few meters is going to be at that infinity focal length, as same as the stars. So yeah, you want to shoot at 2.8 or your maximum aperture of the lens possible to let the most light in, so that you can compensate with the shorter shutter speed, so less star trails, and lower ISO, which is going to be a less grainy or noisy image. So just to show you guys, I'm going to go ahead and do a 30-second exposure, and I'm going to take another shot now. Alright, great. So let's zoom in, and you can see, if I zoom in, that there is some streaking on the stars. It's not terrible. This is also because I'm at 15 millimeters, so if you were a little bit tighter at 20 millimeters, for instance, 24 millimeters, you have to go even shorter with your shutter speed to get streak-free stars. We got a couple shots now for the sky that I'm happy with. I'm actually going to take one more for the sky at 25 seconds, which is kind of borderline maximum shutter speed that I can get. And I'm going to go ahead and take another shot at ISO 4000, just for the sky to be a little bit brighter and we can have a better exposure for the sky. I'm going to take a shot now. Alright, so we'll review this one now. And the sky is noticeably brighter. It looks really good. And I don't see a ton of noise, but again, we're going to do noise reduction in post-processing, so not a huge deal. Don't be afraid of a little bit of noise. One thing to consider is, you want to use a low ISO when possible, so crop sensors, micro four thirds, are going to be a little bit less flexible with the noise at higher ISOs. So that's where, a 1.8 lens would definitely come in handy if you have one, but 2.8 or a kit lens, you just have to push the ISO a little bit higher. So I'm happy with the shots for the sky. Next, we're going to take a longer exposure for the foreground by itself at a lower ISO, and we're going to bump up the aperture a little bit so it's just a little bit sharper. So I'm going to change my ISO settings for this to, we'll go ahead and go to 2000, and I'm going to change my aperture to 3.2, and I'm going to flip this into time mode. So time mode means that when you touch the shutter, it's going to start the shot, and then when you touch the shutter again, it's going to end the shot. You could also use bulb mode, which is where you hold the shutter down physically on the remote or on the camera, and then when you let go of it, it's going to stop the shot. So a remote is very handy for this, and a remote in general when shooting astro is very handy, so you don't cause camera shake when you take the photo. I use the shutter exposure delay, so that basically there's a 0.5 second delay after I touch the shutter before it takes the shot, so the camera shake stops. So I have a very sturdy tripod, so I can get away with this, but ideally you're going to use a remote. So for this, I'm going to do the time mode, and I'm going to go ahead and take let's go with a 90-second shot. So I'm going to go ahead and open up the stopwatch on my phone, and I'm going to go ahead and take a 90-second shot now. Alright, so reviewing the 90-second shot, I can see that we have some detail on the foreground. It's a little bit bright. The actual foreground is brighter than the rock and the background with the tree on it, a little bit lighter in color, so it's reflecting a little bit more light from the sky, from the stars. So I do want some more light and details on the actual rock with the tree. So we could do a few things. We could either adjust the aperture from 3.2 to 2.8. We could do a longer shutter speed. We could increase the ISO. So I'm going to increase the ISO up from 2000 to 2500. I'm going to also change the aperture from 3.2 to 2.8. And the reason we had it at 3.2 originally is because the higher the number, the more detail potentially would be in the foreground. It would be just a little bit sharper. So it's not going to be too much of a noticeable difference between 3.2 and 2.8, so we'll just put it at 2.8 to let just a little bit more light in. Additionally, we're going to change the shutter speed this time from 90 seconds to 3 minutes, And with those 3 changes, I think that we're going to get enough light and detail on the foreground. So we'll go ahead and take another shot now at the new settings for 3 minutes. Alright, awesome. So this new shot at 3 minutes with the higher ISO and aperture of 2.8 produced exactly what I wanted. We have a lot more detail in the foreground. As you can see, the stars are super streaked at 3 minutes, which looks kind of cool, but we're actually going to just blend the shorter exposure that we took earlier in with this foreground to produce our final result. So this is even a little bit brighter than I might want it, so we'll play with it in post and maybe darken it a little bit, but we definitely have a little bit more detail in the shadows to play with. Alright, so now we're back in the studio for the post-processing portion. I'm going to show you guys how I would assess these photos to figure out which would be the best to edit. Then we're going to go ahead and open them up in Photoshop, and I'll show you how to blend them together. Alright, so first looking at our shortest exposure, this is the 22nd, we can see that the sky is very sharp, our stars look good, so this would be a great candidate for our star shot. The stars have a tiny bit of streaking, which indicates that I should have probably gone with a shorter shutter speed. In hindsight, my camera is a little bit higher resolution. When you have a higher resolution sensor, you want to err on the caution with the 500 or 400 rule that we used and go just a little bit shorter. So 15 seconds would have probably been more ideal for these shots to have pin sharp stars, but then we would have had to gone up to a really high ISO and it'd be even more noisy. So we're gonna go ahead and stick with this shot for our sky, and you can see at 25 seconds we have more star streak, and then at 30 seconds we have even more star streak, so that's not gonna work. And then 90 seconds, you know, we have some detail on our foreground, so this could be a candidate for our foreground shot, but the stars obviously won't work. And then this is the 3-minute exposure, super bright. Like I mentioned when we were shooting, we probably would actually tone the exposure down in this one, but I think we'll go ahead and use this one for the foreground and our first shot for the sky. So I'm in Adobe Bridge. I'm gonna go ahead and select both of these images and then double click on them. If you're in Lightroom, it's gonna be a similar process as far as this editing goes, and then you would just select both of the photos, right click, and then click edit in Photoshop as layers. So for our sky exposure, I'm not gonna do a ton. I'm just gonna brighten up the exposure a little bit, and then I'm gonna increase the whites just a little bit. I'm also gonna go ahead and use a radial filter, and I'm gonna draw it just to go over the core. And I'm just gonna check this mask options here, which shows me where my mask is, and I'm gonna go ahead and just increase the whites and the clarity just a little bit, just to make that core pop. All right, now for the foreground shot, I'm gonna go ahead and decrease the exposure just a little bit like I mentioned, and we'll go ahead and raise the shadows just a little to open up a little more detail in the blacks. We could even increase the blacks a little bit, and then I'm gonna dehaze this a little, add a little contrast and punch, and then I'm gonna increase the vibrance. And I'm also going to play around with the white balance. So I think I'm gonna go ahead and use the eyedropper tool, and I will select something neutral on the frame. And that looks pretty accurate, maybe just a little touch too warm. So I'm gonna cool that back off just a little bit. Something like that looks pretty good. And I see just a touch of magenta in there, so I'm gonna decrease the magenta a little and go back towards the green. All right, so I'm also gonna select both of these guys, and I'm gonna enable my profile corrections, and that should automatically select my lens for me, which it did. And I'm gonna turn the distortion off and just have the vignette correction on. You can see that that actually takes a lot of the vignette from the lens out. So I'm actually gonna decrease the vignette just a little more because I want just a little bit of vignette. So I think that looks pretty good. And remove chromatic aberrations already checked. So I have both of my images selected. I'm gonna go ahead and open those up in Photoshop. All right, so I'm gonna select my move tool or hit V on the keyboard, and I'm just gonna click on my image, and I'm gonna drag it up onto the other tab without letting go, and then I'm gonna hover over my other image and then let go of the cursor, and it's just gonna drop the other picture right on top. So because we shot these on a tripod, they line up perfectly. We do not need to do any type of alignment, but I am gonna go ahead and exit out of my other photo that we're not using, and I have my stack here. So there's a few ways that we could go about selecting the sky. I think that in this case, I'm gonna make a selection from the shadows on my background image. So what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna go ahead and select color range, and I'm gonna pick the shadows here, and I'm gonna decrease the fuzziness a little bit so I isolate that selection, and that looks pretty good. And again, I'm really just focusing on the selection around the horizon here. So I can add to the selection by holding down Shift and sample. I'm gonna undo that because that was too much. I'm actually just gonna use it as it is right now. I'm gonna click OK. So now I have my foreground isolated with the selection that we just made from the shadows. I'm gonna go ahead and unlock this background layer. I'm gonna deselect, and then I'm gonna make a copy of my foreground layer and sandwich the sky layer in between the two. All right, so I'm gonna go ahead and add a layer mask to my foreground layer, and I'm gonna hit Command-Shift-D to reselect, or you could also do that from the select panel. And then I'm gonna invert the selection by going ahead and clicking on inverse, or you can hit the keyboard shortcut, which is Command-Shift-I or Control-Shift-I on a PC. Now I'm gonna go ahead and select my layer mask here, and I'm gonna go ahead and choose my brush and use black on the keyboard and paint at 100% opacity and 100% flow. I'm gonna go ahead and paint right along the edge of my horizon here. All right, so we have the selection enabled right now, so I'm very precise around the horizon. But once you get above the horizon, you can go ahead and deselect and go ahead and paint that sky back in. So this looks pretty good, and if I zoom in, it's going to be a very clean selection that we made based off of the shadows in the foreground, and it really doesn't need any further work. So that looks really good. I'm happy with that. And now you can see that we have our bright foreground blended in with our shorter exposure for the sky. Alright, so now that we have our sky masked in, we can go ahead and make some tweaks to this photo to make some adjustments to make them kind of blend together better. So first thing I'm going to do, I'm going to add a photo filter above the sky layer, and I'm just going to play around with this a little bit. Let's see what a cooling filter looks like. I like that. I'm going to turn down the opacity a little bit, but I do like the blue effect. And I'm going to go ahead and add a photo filter for the foreground. I'm going to clip it to the foreground so it only affects the foreground layer. So if you make a clipping mask, you just hold down Option or Alt on a PC and then hover between the two layers that you want to clip together. And in this case, I'm just clipping the photo filter layer to the foreground. So now this photo filter only affects the foreground, and that looks really good. So I could also add a curves layer, and because I'm working underneath this foreground layer here, you can see that whatever adjustments that I make underneath this layer, because it is underneath the layer, it's only going to affect what's below or visible through this layer mask. So I'm going to go ahead and brighten the sky up just a little bit. Actually, I'm going to do this. I'm going to add some contrast by bringing the shadows down a little and the highlights up a little bit. And I'm noticing now that I need to paint this sky back in a little bit better in some spots that I missed. Okay, that looks good. So now that I'm happy with these adjustments that I've done, I'm going to go ahead and merge these all together into one photo. So I'm going to do that by stamping visible. The keyboard shortcut for that is going to be Command Option Shift and E on a Mac, or Control Alt Shift E on a PC, and I can just rename this merged or blended or whatever helps you to stay organized. Now I'm going to go up to the camera raw filter within Photoshop, and I'm going to adjust this photo now as if it's one image. So I'm going to go ahead and add a vignette, and this is going to help kind of tie the image together and draw the viewer's eye towards this tree and the core. So the way that I like to do vignettes is I like to turn off the feather completely. I like to make the vignette strong, and then I can really see where it is. So in this case, I'm gonna bring the midpoint in to be kind of just around this center portion and the core, and then I'm gonna increase the feather to where I want it. Something like that looks good. And I'm gonna decrease the strength of the vignette just a little bit. All right, so I also want to brighten up the shadows on this foreground just a touch. See a little bit more detail here. And then I wanna darken the exposure in the bottom. So I'm gonna use a graduated filter. If you hold down Shift when you're making your graduated filters, so in this case I'm gonna hold down Shift and I'm gonna drag from the bottom, and it's gonna keep your lines straight. So I'm gonna go ahead and turn on the mask option so I can see where this filter is. And the top line dictates where the adjustment ends. It's gonna be the ending point of the filter. And then the bottom line dictates the feather between the two. So in this case, if I put it closer, it's gonna be a more abrupt stop. It's gonna be a way more noticeable difference. And then if I feather it out, it's gonna be a more gradual difference between the two. So I'll show you an example of this now. So I'm gonna go ahead and uncheck this mask, and if I decrease the exposure, you can see when they're further apart, it's gonna be gradual, and then the closer that I get to the first line, it's gonna be a lot more noticeable. It's gonna be a hard line. So we want it to be a little bit more gradual, so we'll go ahead and come somewhere down in this range, and we're gonna fix this exposure. I didn't wanna make it that dark. I just wanna make it something like this. We'll decrease the highlights just a touch and the shadows just a touch. And that looks pretty good. I'm gonna go ahead and just increase the whites a little bit to make it pop. And I'm gonna bring the blacks down just a touch to add some contrast, and I think that looks pretty good. So that's our basic exposure adjustments within Photoshop. Again, we tied the viewer's eye towards the middle with the vignette, and by darkening this foreground, generally speaking, the viewer's eye is gonna go to the brightest point of the photo. So in this case, it's gonna be our Milky Way and this center part of the foreground. So I'm happy with that. I'm gonna go ahead and click OK. And now you can see that we started with this sky image here and with this foreground image with the sky overexposed, and we wound up with a nice blended version of the two adjusted. So that's pretty much it, guys. I hope that you found this helpful. If you have any questions at all, go ahead and leave a comment and I'll get back to you. Be on the lookout for more free trainings coming soon. Until then, keep learning and keep creating.